It's 4 o'clock in Radio Cairo. This is World of Info.
There's a time that I remember when I never felt so loved.
My name is Dr. Amr Mabrouk. With me, Dua Muhammad is at the controls. And today is a very special day in Studio 3. We have our direct line number is 257-89407. And we are here in World of Info with the one and only His Excellency, Ambassador Jan Tesleff, the Ambassador of Sweden in Cairo. A dear friend and a friend of Egypt and friend of me personal, and a man who was a gentleman who was so kind enough to come to our program for 3 times during his, shall I say, short tenure. Egypt is feeling a bit sad today because His Excellency is finishing his tenure in Egypt, but he said to us just before when we went on air that Egypt is part of his life and part of his heart. Excellency, thank you very much for coming to our radio program in such a short notice.
Thank you very much, and it feels, Dr. Mabrouk, to be on this show is like coming home. And the 3rd time, and if you beg me, I will come a 4th time too.
No, we will beg you, and we please, whenever you're here in Cairo, you'll come. So just before we go on talking about Sweden and Egypt and Swedish-Egyptian relations, we have to stop on a personal level and say that His Excellency is, shall we so say, an Arabist. I mean, because he served a lot of his tenures in Arab world. He worked in Abu Dhabi as the ambassador and ambassador in Riyadh, and he also in Tunisia and in Libya and different other embassies, and of course that he has come to Egypt to be the ambassador, and now he has a very important, distinguished mission with the Swedish government in Expo 2022. Tell us about that in Dubai.
Yes, I'm sad to leave Egypt, but at the same time I will not leave because I will continue working this time from Dubai. Expo 2020, which has been postponed until 2021 because of the pandemic. You know, all the world has had to stop a little bit. But on the 1st of October 2021, there will be the Universal Expo in Dubai. 192 countries participating. Sweden is one of them. Egypt is one of them. And it will be a challenge and an opportunity for us all, I think, to hopefully after the pandemic, when things are getting better, to start a new chapter in the region, in the world, a new start after the pandemic, and we hope that new start will also start in Dubai in October 2021.
So you'll be your job will be the commissioner of the whole Expo, sir, or the Swedish part only, if I may ask?
No, I will be Commissioner General for Sweden.
Yes.
We have it's an engagement between government and private enterprise. So we have 110 different partners who are contributing to our pavilion. We are building
so 110 Swedish companies.
Exactly.
And that's why they needed such an experienced ambassador to do all this magnificent job of having the best out of Sweden in this expo, right, sir?
You know, it's a huge event and with many stakeholders. But that's what also makes it so exciting. So you have government, you have private companies, 192 countries participating. It's like the whole world, like the world in miniature. I've already been in contact with my Egyptian colleague, the one who will head the Egyptian pavilion, and I'm sure we will cooperate between Sweden and Egypt in Dubai also. So this is very challenging. I must say I'm very excited.
So this will be almost like a 14-month tenure, right, sir?
The expo itself is 6 months, from October 21 until March 22. But of course, there's a preparation period, there's a follow-up period. So totally, it's 14 months.
It's of course, it's very interesting because the World Expo, I mean, we have seen that, for example, it's been always world changing and history changing, like the expo that happened in Paris, how famous it was. I mean, with the Eiffel Tower, it was one of its byproducts, imagine that. And what they have said about the Egyptian section in this expo in 100, almost more than 100 years ago. So this always, the expo, the World Expo, is something that's a big challenge. How frequent does it happen, and what type do they choose the country, how they choose the country to have this World Expo?
The last time Sweden participated in the big expo was in Shanghai, and that was in 2010. The next, now it's was supposed to be 2020 in Dubai, and next one is in Osaka in Japan in 2025.
So is it a 5-yearly?
Yes, it's a 5-year yearly, yes.
And of course, world wars have stopped it, and famines have stopped it, diseases have stopped it. I mean, how far does this habit go, or this tradition goes? Till the early 20th century?
No, to the first one I think was in the mid 19th century, and in those days, the World Expo was something different than today, because when you brought steam engines and you showed them in public for the first time, that was like a revolution. You brought the new technologies to people. The expos today are different. It's not only the new technologies, it's how things are connected. How do things fit together? If you look at the 3 different themes of the Dubai Expo, is sustainability, opportunity, and mobility. And Sweden has its pavilion in the sustainability part. And if we think about the time we are living in with all the challenges for the world, I think sustainability is actually the part where one should be. Exactly. It's all about finding new sustainable solutions, things that will last, things that will resist, even when we are challenged as we are today.
So since this will be, I think, no better introduction to our real program today, which is about Sweden and, of course, Swedish-Egyptian relations. So we went to Abu Dhabi today, but we are back to Stockholm, because this is where we want to go now, because Sweden has been one of very rare countries that was able to maintain its neutrality for 200 years, and this celebration was in 2014. Sweden has celebrated that they lived without wars for 200 years, and this was like sailing in uncharted water. I mean, imagine a country that was able to escape wars, 2 world wars, and escape a lot of crises, and pass through great times of economic recession. And even in the 19th century, Sweden was, unfortunately, an expelling country. A lot of Swedish people were not able to find a real good income in Sweden, and immigrated and formed part of the closely knitted Swedish community in the New World, whether this in the United States or in Canada, but mainly in the United States. So how we have to although it's a question that we always ask to you when we come to our program, but it's always something that is definitely jumps to the minds of our listeners, how Sweden was ever able to pass all these times, these hard times, uncharted water, and all these wars unscathed by the hardships of the war. How was that possible, and how difficult was that?
You're right that we stayed out of the wars, but we don't stay out of responsibility.
Very good.
And I think that is probably the if you just try to escape, it will not save you. So something you mentioned, the neutrality, the non-alignment of Sweden, etc. That's of course a characteristic of our history. But I think also, when you come from a country like mine with 10 million inhabitants, you realize that the biggest part of the world is not within, but beyond our borders. And there's been very early on a very strong engagement, international commitment, so to say. We are one of the most active members of the United Nations. Now, since 1995, we are one of the active countries of the European Union. I think there's always been this feeling that we cannot manage alone. We have to engage with others. We have to be an active part of the world community. And this has translated itself into, for example, a strong engagement when it comes to peacekeeping and peace building. And I know that Egypt is our partner in this.
Of
I mean,
course.
Egypt is also a very active member of the United Nations on many peacekeeping missions, including in Mali. We've been serving jointly. I mean, side by side, Egyptian and Swedish peacekeepers. 80,000 Swedish women and men have served in peacekeeping.
Yes.
It's huge.
And I remember, of course, the role in all the UNTSO, that's the United Nations Truth Supervisors and Observers in Sinai in 1973,
Yes.
and of course onwards, and even I think there was also a contingent in Syria.
Even in 56 we
Yes,
were
in 56 this was a very important job. They stayed from 56 till 67, and since we are talking about history of peace and United Nations involvement, we have to give a mention. Without going much into details, with great respect to the Count Bernadotte, the Swedish gentleman, the Swedish cousin of the king, a member of the royal family, and yet he was able, through his utmost sincerity to humanity, to help a lot of people to escape death in World War II, in concentration camps, and his trials to save a lot of hundreds and thousands of lives, and his efforts in Palestine in 1948, and of course the great work of Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General of the United Nations, who lost his life trying to make peace accords in Africa. So mentioning these dignified Swedes and the dignified role of the 80,000 peacekeepers through the years, almost since 1945 with the inauguration of the United Nations, this is definitely a lot of respect that we carry, that the blue hats or the blue caps, and they're the same color like the color of the Swedish flag. So we have to go also in another question that we always ask you, and it's always important because this is a big challenge, which is the social welfare system. It provides universal health care, and this is the motto of Sweden, has been passing through this for many times and many years, and yet it has faced a lot of challenges, especially in 2020. You were having a challenge like all the countries of the world with the COVID. How did the Swedish government deal? I mean, they had a unique approach to COVID, depending, I think, from my point of view, on the fact that Swedish people, since they are living in a vast areas, and usually the social communication is not that common, especially there is a lot of respect to the social distance and social distancing. How was Sweden and the Swedish government able to face this crisis of Corona? We need to gain your experience with. I know that some of the Swedish government officials came back and said we were not right in this, but we were right in that. So tell us about this whole experience.
I think that COVID-19 is the big lesson for us all.
Yes.
And the lesson, I think, one of the lessons is that you cannot say who is right and who is wrong. You might be able to say with time. Mm-hmm. When we look back on this crisis, maybe years from now, we'll be able to say, this country or this agency did it right, others did it wrong. Mm. But right now, we must be compassionate in a way with the policies devised by different countries and different actors.
Improvisation, of course. Yes.
And in the case of each country, something that fits Sweden might not fit Egypt or fit the United States or some other country. So there's not one size that fits all when it comes to this. Our approach has been, I think, has three aspects in it. One is that it's a whole of government approach. Mm-hmm. So all government agencies, all ministries, everyone has gotten together in a joint and coordinated fashion from very early on during the crisis. Because Corona or COVID is actually an attack on society. Mm-hmm. Of course on individuals, yes, but also on society. Because it paralyzes society.
Of course. So
whole of government. The other thing that I think is also characteristic is that we've had a scientific approach. Mm-hmm. more scientific than political. And I will tell you what I mean by that. We have a tradition since the 18th century of independent agencies and institutions in different fields. And we have the same things when it comes to pandemics and viruses. We have agencies specialized in analyzing and preventing. And the government has listened very closely to these agencies.
Very.
So the word of science has been very strong, and the scientific approach, I think, has given like credibility to the government's approach.
Yes.
So that's the second aspect. And the third aspect is, in general, we have not imposed binding rules to say this is not allowed, this is forbidden, we have to close down. No, we have said that if you behave in a certain way, you create great danger for yourself, for your loved ones, and for society. So act responsibly, and then we've given advice how to act responsibly. And not only washing your hands, but there are many other ways how to act responsibly. So I think, and Swedes are used to, we listen to the messages from science, from the government, and normally, of course, not everyone, but most people say, okay, if this is what science says, we will try to do it. So it's been a voluntary approach, but with advice from science and from government.
What I mean with the science is that the gentleman who's responsible for the non-governmental scientific research body or organization for the healthcare and health prevention and epidemics prevention came out maybe 2 or 3 months back, and he said, I think the advice was not 100% correct. Do you have any comment about that?
You know, by admitting...
It was his advice, not
Yes.
the advice that the government followed, you know.
But by admitting that you sometimes made a wrong evaluation, because
Exactly.
this virus is so unpredictable.
Of course, it has an erratic behavior, and me
Yes.
as a physician could tell you this.
Yes. So by admitting that, I think you gain credibility. When you say that you are perfect, if he had said that in his analysis, in his way of doing it, I think people would have starting to doubt. But he admitted this was right, this was not so right, this we could have done better.
Exactly.
And I think that one thing that has come out in the analysis that we are already now continuously reviewing and doing is that we failed in the beginning of the crisis to protect sufficiently the elderly population.
Yes.
And that has been admitted by everyone, and of course we have tried to address that as well as we can.
Yes.
But that was a mistake, and of course it's very, very sad, tragic consequences. But we learn as we go along, even if it has huge humanitarian and personal consequences for many people.
So, how is Sweden faring in the second wave now? I mean, the second wave has come and started to enroll on the world. I mean, if you use this expression, it's now reaching every corner in the earth with the second wave of the new virus. And as a physician can tell you, this is a new virus. It's slightly mutated than the one that we had in the summer. And we remember in the 1917 epidemic of the Spanish flu, 1917 was a very simple flu, and people didn't lose their life. The second wave was very fatal, and the third wave was much easier. So how is Sweden faring with the second wave?
It is, as you say, it's a very different wave also in Sweden. Right now, the number of cases have been rising, but again, they have been rising irregularly. For example, the southern part of my country did fairly well during the first wave. I mean, few cases, few serious cases. Now the southern part of the country is very badly hit. So, and it's very hard, I think, yet to see exactly the reasons for this. So there are regional differences. Schools, or some schools, are now closing down again. Work from home is very prevalent. But still we keep, for example, shops open, we keep public transportation open, we have restriction on public gatherings, etc. But no one is safe from the second or the third wave, or we don't know how many waves there will be. But
God forbid, I hope.
But as you said, they are different each time. And now, of course, we put our hope and faith in the distribution of vaccines, and that they will be effective, and that we will be able to reach as many people as possible. Because it has to do with reaching people also. It's not only having the vaccine, but reaching them.
You're going for the Western vaccine, right?
Yes, we are going actually for a mix of different manufacturers. Is not one of them, but we hope that there will be the rollout will start at the very end of this month, 27th, 28th. I saw the last figure of December. And then, of course, it has to be rolled out gradually and to the most vulnerable groups first, etc. Maybe healthcare workers, maybe people who are, exposed
vulnerable,
to this in the front line, so to say, towards the. But there are, of course, there's a lot of planning and a lot of challenges in this. But we are on track when it comes to this.
And it will be the one with the 2 doses, right?
Yes, it will be the one with 2 doses. Yes, 2 doses.
Okay. So I think we have to leave Corona, because this has been the talk of ourselves and everybody that I know of, and the same thing goes with you. In the past, almost we're approaching 1 year now. So let's talk about something different, about Sweden, and stay with us. After the break, we'll talk with His Excellency Ambassador Jan Tesleff, Ambassador of Sweden in Cairo, who's honoring us with his visit to our radio program. So, still listening to the World of Info with His Excellency Ambassador Jan Tesleff. We'll talk about Sweden, and we'll talk about something that a developed nation always passes through. A developed nation like Sweden, in the beginning, in the early 19th century, there was an economic recession. There was a country that was expelling part of its not attracting the immigrants because of a lot of economic problems. And then Sweden was on the right track. It was becoming able to build industries, and industries at that time in the early 20th century were heavy industries, the heavy industries of shipbuilding or the wood pulp industries. All these were doing fine. Then, after the embargo of oil, the extensive increase in the price, and the environment problems of all these heavy industries, suddenly Sweden was able to discover that in order to survive, you have to change completely. And if you're not going to change, you'll be exactly like the dinosaurs, an extinct developed nation. People would look and say, Sweden was great economy, now it's in recession, and then that's it. So how were you able, as a government, state, and the people, to pay the heavy price to change from a heavy industry motivated country into a country that is more into modern tech and high-tech industries and scientific research, and trying to bring up back the economy?
I think that the big shift, and I will illustrate it actually by a quote, but the big shift that came in Sweden, and I think that was prompted by the crisis that you mentioned that we went through, first in the 80s, then in the 90s. The big shift was that we went from want to be protectionist in the sense when it comes to protecting jobs and protecting industries, to instead saying, no, we'll protect the people. Our Prime Minister said some years ago, and I think it's a lovely quote, he said that I'm not afraid of the new technologies, I'm afraid of the old technologies. Mm-hmm. And what he meant was that if you hang on to what you have, you will lose out, because the future and the new technologies and influences, especially with globalization, will come anyway.
Will be swept by the tide.
And
right?
will catch up with you. Mm. So better embrace the new instead of dreaming of the past. Mm. And that has been very much the the policy of Sweden for the past 30 years. To see when we see that a certain industry or line of business is maybe being phased out, maybe because technology is changing. You remember when we had the normal cameras and we had the film rolls in them, and now everything is digital. If you then would hang on to the old film, you would be out of business very quickly.
Of course.
So we said, okay, we will embrace the new technologies, but we will also focus on the people who worked in the old technologies, upgrading their skills, finding new opportunities for them. Instead of protecting the old job, we protect the people. So that, I think, has been, let's say, this is in very short words, I think, the policy. The other thing, which I think is a very interesting lesson, and I think I see similarities between Egypt and Sweden, is, as you mentioned, in the early 90s, Sweden went through a very difficult economic situation. We reformed our financial sector. We went through a structural reform when it came to our economy that was unprecedented. And when I see the efforts of Egypt in later years, from 2016 and onwards, also the very heavy reforms that Egypt has undertaken, some of them very brave reforms, but of course painful also.
Very painful.
Reform is also is always painful, and it has consequences not for parts of society but for all of society. But sometimes this kind of painful processes are necessary to move on. And we had them in the 90s, and because we went through them early, actually when we were faced with new challenges, for example in 2008, 2009, Sweden managed much better than many other countries because we had gone through that before. So I think that there are similarities. We have to have respect for the hardships of countries and of people, but reforms cannot be resisted, because then one will fall behind.
So you were telling about the policy of the government and the important motto, which I think Sweden has been always taking care of, which is the social protection, the protection of the human being. It's not important the machine, it's not important the stone. What's important is the human being behind this stone or behind this machine. But this needs a lot of re-education and redirection of all this manpower. And this could be easy for the young population getting into the market of business, like the 20 to 30 sector. People who are aged 20 to 30, they are accepting, or 35, they are accepting the challenges, they are accepting the change, and they will go on and change, or this is not a change, so they will take it as a new challenge for them, and they will become good members of the new industry or the new technology. But when you're talking about a person who is in his early 40s or his 50s, who's working, for example, in the shipbuilding system, and this is becoming like an extinct industry, and you are decided to close or shut down these shipyards for better industries, how were you able to deal with this sector of age, the 40 to 60 working class who have been working in this shipyard for the past 20 to 30 years in their lives, and you suddenly tell them, I'm going to change you into another business? How was that possible, and how was that feasible?
I think it's been a mix of two things. Of course, as you say, it's much harder for those who are have already worked in a certain business, a certain industry for a long time, to adapt and also to find a new job. So you need to have a combination of a social protection system that is working. That's number one. And secondly, you must invest in education, in training and research and development. Any country in the world that only copies technology of others, they might do well for a certain time, but if you don't use the creative force of your own, you will also lose out. And I think we have learned that 3.4% of our GDP, our gross national product, is actually going into research and development. To create new technologies that are Swedish, that are ours. And by doing that, you create, you have a creative engine within the country. We don't copy only what others do, but we let other peoples eventually copy us. And when after a few years now in Egypt, and I see the young population of Egypt, and as you said, I served here many years ago also, and I see one of the big changes when I go out in Egyptian society and I meet young Egyptians is that, first of all, their talent is much more coming to the forefront. They are no longer a figure; they are actually a force in the country. I see entrepreneurs, I see innovators. I was at the Techni Summit in Alexandria a month ago, speaking as one of the keynote speakers. 3,000 people physically and 7,000 people digitally. 10,000 people. And the similar events that will take place, the Rise Up Summit that takes place in Cairo early next year, all these things should not be underestimated. That's the real natural resource of this country, as it is for my country. Wood is good, steel is good, but people are better.
Definitely, I totally agree with you. And once I was discussing with the Indian ambassador in Cairo, a common friend of ours, of both of us, and he was telling me that you could always think of the huge population of India, for example, or of Egypt, as 100 million or in case of India, 1 billion mouths to feed, or 100 million minds to think, or 200 million hands to work. So when we are talking about that, we have to give a mention, with all due respect, to the Swedish authorities or the Swedish policy. So it's been a policy of different governments, that is to amalgamate the immigrants, to allow in immigrants and to educate them, because you had a demographic problem, right? A number of the pure Swedes or the Swedish residents, if we use the expression, we don't want to use pure and impure. So the Swedish population has been on decline, with decrease in the number of births, right, for some time. So accepting new challenges and new immigrants has been part of policy of acceptance and mutual trust between the world outside and Sweden. How far this affected the rising economy of Sweden?
We had an aging population, and as so many other industrial nations, we had this aging population problem. So we had fewer and fewer young, active people who should help to support the older, aging people.
Yes.
We've had, since the 1950s, since after the Second World War, a flow, sometimes steady and sometimes in waves, of immigrants. The first ones came from Italy. We had immigrants who came from Italy in the 50s. Italy had problems and facing a lot of hardships after the war. They came to work in our car industry.
They changed the government every 9 months. It's a statistic.
It's true. And they built Volvos and they built Saab cars in the car industry. These were the early wave. We had always people coming from Finland, moving also over. I'm part of those, half Swedish, half Finnish population. We had people from former Yugoslavia coming to our country. We had people from Syria coming in Syria and Palestine coming late 70s, early 80s. And then we had other waves. For me, to absorb new people in huge numbers in a short time is a challenge for those who come.
And those who accept.
And those who accept. It's a double challenge.
Exactly.
But over time, the immigration, today we have about 20% of our population is of immigrant background. And I'm one of them.
Yes.
I'm one of the 20%. Over time, this has created the country that we have today. And I can tell you, I was born 61 years ago.
You're quite young. I thought you were 16.
Thank you. 61 years ago in Sweden, a Sweden that looked completely different than the Sweden we have today. And I can say that I much rather live in Sweden of today than the Sweden where I was born. We have is much more vibrant society, much more diverse, much more rich, not only in monetary terms but also in cultural terms.
Of course.
Mentality has changed. But we have to see it short term, medium term, and long term. Long term, this is good.
So the acceptance of the other is on the rise? On both sides, I mean?
Short term, there are always tensions when new groups come in big waves.
Yes.
But when you look at those immigrant groups who have now spent, who are second generation or spent maybe 10, 20, 30 years, they are very well integrated.
Yes, exactly.
The Italians who came in the 50s and worked as workers in the industry, they now own the industry. Those who came from former Yugoslavia in the 80s and they maybe worked in restaurants, they own the restaurants, or maybe chains of restaurants. Syrians the same. This will be the consequence long term for those who come now also. But we have to accept that it will take time.
Yes.
And it's painful for those who come. There is frustration, there might be tension, economic and social hardships for sure. But with time, it will benefit those who came and it will benefit my country. But we must not forget, why did people leave their countries? They left their countries because they were facing difficulties. And I come back to the Swedish engagement again, engagement abroad, is that you cannot be a recipient of immigrants only. You must also look at why do they have to leave their countries? What are the hardships, the wars, the conflicts that they are fleeing? And that triggers us to be engaged and be internationally committed.
Of course. Well, this is very interesting because this will bring us on the subject of your capacity as an ambassador here in Cairo, because this is your second tenure as a diplomat in the Swedish embassy in Cairo, and at the same time a man with vast experience in the Middle East. Definitely you had a great impact on the Egyptian-Swedish relations. So after the break, we'll talk about Egyptian-Swedish relations and how to improve this and what happened and in this past 2 or 3 years, and what are the prospects for further cooperation in this. So we are still listening to the World of Info. We're coming to you live from Radio Cairo. So nothing more fitting than ABBA with the Swedish ambassador in Cairo, His Excellency Ambassador Jan Tesleff. Really, we are very proud to have you with us, and we're very happy that we're having ABBA on air with us as well, with a special request, and your song is going to be the finale of our program. We're going to tell our listeners it's a surprise, but it's very fitting. So tell us about the Egyptian-Swedish relations. I think it's one of the most constant pillars of Egyptian-Swedish relations. It has been always good, great, with no much... never has been there any conflict in interest, never there has been any conflict of relations. Everything was going smooth in this relation that dates back to tens of years or maybe 100 years since the inauguration or since the establishment of our independent Egypt in 1922-23. So tell us about this relation. We'll talk about the past, the present, but we're very much interested in the future.
Thank you very much. And as you said, our relations have always been very good, and I think the image of our countries have always been good. And that's witnessed by the many Swedish tourists that traditionally have been coming to Egypt. Until 2011, we had 250,000 Swedes who every year came mostly to the Red Sea to enjoy the beautiful waters of Egypt, and also, of course, culture of Egypt.
I will tell a personal secret that you visited the Red Sea 18 times, right?
18 times, yes, I must say, and I wish to visit 18 more times, because
Inshallah, yes.
I love both that and the North Coast, of course, also. So the image has always been positive, and when I meet Egyptians, they always say that they have a very positive image of my country. But one of the what I felt as my task when I came here in 2017 was to put some meat on the bones of that positive image. Because people say, yes, we love your country, and when I ask them why, they go a little bit silent. There's a positive image, but I wanted to put some meat on the bones so that they will say, yes, Sweden is good because. And I've been working together with my colleagues at the embassy and with my colleagues in Stockholm very actively on this and quite tirelessly. And we have worked on a number of themes that where we think that we have a strength, where we together can learn something, we from Egypt and you from Sweden. And I feel now that when I speak to the same Egyptians almost that I talked to a few years ago, people say, yes, we like you because you are engaged, for example, on the role and empowerment of women, for example. We've been tried to be very vocal and together with Egyptian partners to highlight the role of women in building society. I always talk in terms of inclusivity. Every country, my own is, I think, a good example. Everyone is contributing to society. Women and men alike are working, are contributing, and get as much as possible equal opportunities. So gender equality is something that has been very high on our agenda. Something that also is I think high on the Egyptian agenda and high on our agenda is sustainability, environmental issues, green technologies. So now when people think about and talk about my country today, they also say, yes, it's a country that has invested a lot in green technologies, etc. So there's something we can learn. And then there are also another area where I think we can learn something from one another, and that's mobility issues, and not only mobility by smartphones or that kind of technologies, but also public transportation is an area where we are working very closely with Egypt today. We've had an exchange. We had a seminar just 3-4 days ago with many Egyptian stakeholders, Ministry of Transport, etc. Your minister, Kamal El-Wazir, visited Sweden in the beginning of the year. Very intense exchange. How can we bring public transportation environmental friendly and people friendly, accessible to all, accessible even if you have a little bit of a physical impairment, you should be able to get on a bus or should be able to get on a train. So accessibility, I think, is the word that comes to mind. So these are, let's say, 3 examples of the meat that we put on the Swedish bones, and that is now associated with my country. So that's a little bit has been my philosophy of finding the key words or the key themes, and the other aspect of it is never to talk about what we do without talking about what we can do together.
Yes. Since we're talking about what we can do together, I think when we were talking before we went on air, that there are a lot of Egyptians who are living in Sweden. There is not a very big population, but it's a very successful one. I know that. And at the same time, there is a lot of very famous and very well-established marriages between Egyptians and Swedish ladies, or vice versa, which have been great success and great impact on the society. Could you tell us some examples? I know for myself, one of my father's colleagues, Dr. Gabriel, he immigrated to Sweden doing neurophysiology in the University of Stockholm. And my father even met him when he visited Stockholm in the 70s or 80s, and it was a great encounter. How do you think? Do you have any knowledge about the Egyptians residing in Sweden and vice versa?
You're so right, and I think that we must remember that today communications are much easier than they were in the past. For a Swedish man or woman to go to Egypt, let's say, not so far back, but in the 50s or 60s, was a big endeavor. It was quite a brave person to travel that far, and maybe alone. And the same way for Egyptians who went to Sweden.
Of course.
Today people travel completely differently. Maybe not during Corona, but normally. And we have examples of Egyptians who early on went as young people to Sweden, maybe got their education in Sweden, married, had a career, distinguished careers, and became very respected pillars of society in their new adopted country. And we also have the same thing when it comes to Swedes who came here. Actually, there were and there are a number of, especially Swedish ladies who came here in the 60s and 70s. They married, they never went back to Sweden, they shaped their families, very successful families.
Like Professor Abulgar's family, right?
Abulgar's family and others. There is like a core group of the society. And actually, when you are ambassador to a country, it is a treasure to have these people, because they have the love for Egypt and they have the love for Sweden, and they are a great support to us, to me, to the embassy. And they are, I think, ambassadors in themselves, because they can really speak with conviction about both Sweden and Egypt. So, no, I love them, I treasure them very much.
So, since we talked about the present time and your efforts, your great efforts to put meat on the bone, I love this expression of the Sweden, and to have a complete sentence, not just I love Sweden because of its environment protection, because its human rights value, especially in the handicapped society, in the needs of the impoverished people as regards to women support. So let's talk about the future prospect of the Swedish-Egyptian relations. I mean, how far are you going to build on that in the future?
I think that the opportunities that lie ahead, that there is a saying that yesterday is the memory of today, and tomorrow is today's dream. And my dream for the future, for tomorrow, is to build on something that I think I mentioned earlier today, but build on the enormous creative, innovative force of Egypt, together with the creative force of my country. If you look at innovation and creative indexes around the world, we are number one. When it comes to creating what they call the unicorns, companies that reach a value of $1 billion, from scratch to $1 billion, Sweden is the biggest, most fertile market for that after Silicon Valley. And Egypt will be that tomorrow, I'm completely convinced. There is a strength in Egypt that will lead to that. And if we can create a marriage between a small country like mine, a small but creative country like mine, and a huge creative country like Egypt, that will be the future for us.
Then the sky is the limit.
The sky is definitely the limit, and so that's one thing that I would really see in the future. The second thing I would like to see in the future, continue to see in the future, is how Egypt and Sweden can engage more globally. Egypt is active in the United Nations. Egypt is active when it comes to peace, security, and development of Africa. It's a big change from my time in the 90s in Egypt and now. I see that Egypt has a very clear African vision.
Of course.
It comes from businessmen, it comes from the president, it comes from everyone.
This I really admire, because we have neglected in the past, prior to the 2010 or 2011, we have neglected the great role of Egypt in Africa. And nowadays, Egypt is coming back to Africa strongly. And acts as a bridgehead between Europe and Africa.
Absolutely, and I see that also Egypt wants, when it comes to peace, security and development, sustainable development in Africa, Egypt wants to assume a leading role. And as you might remember, in 2019, there was something called the Aswan Forum that took place in Aswan. Exactly on that theme, Sweden was a strategic partner of Egypt at that event. And we will continue to work together with Egypt when it comes to these efforts to really build on a sustainable peace and development in Africa and elsewhere. So that's the second leg of our opportunity, of our let's say future opportunities. So as you said, the sky is the limit.
Excellency, we are very proud of your presence here. We are very sad that you're leaving us, but you said that you'll always come again to our program and to Cairo, your second capital, if I may use the expression. You were saying that because of the number of services and the number of time you visited Egypt, you will become more or less an Egyptian. You shared with us your wisdom, and you shared with us a lot of food for thought. And I believe this is very kind of you. When we meet, a meeting of minds, definitely a lot of good results can come out. Your Excellency, Ambassador Jan Tesleff, Ambassador of Sweden in Cairo, it was a great pleasure and honor to have you in Radio Cairo and to have you in Egypt as an ambassador, a distinguished ambassador to your beautiful country in Cairo. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for having me, and a piece of my heart is definitely in the Egyptian soil for sure, and will stay there. And I will be happy to come back as many times as possible. You said 18 times to the Red Sea. I hope it will be 18 more times, not only to the Red Sea, but to the Nile Valley, to Siwa Oasis, to the North Coast, to lovely Cairo, and to Sinai, of course. So all these places in my heart and in my mind. I'm not leaving, I'm just taking a small pause.
And you have to know that you'll always be there in our hearts, in our minds, and there is always an extra plate on the table for you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Bon appetit.
Bon appetit. This was the World of Info. Please stay with us for further programs, and we're looking forward to see you in the same time, same station, Radio Cairo. Dua Muhammad was at the controls. My name is Dr. Amr Mabrouk.